Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. I'm glad that you joined us. This is a podcast where we seek to equip you to live with biblical clarity and confidence in our chaotic world. And what we're doing in this episode is this is a part 2. It's a follow-up to what I did in the last episode, which was asking and answering the question, what are church elders? This is something that we're doing because I think there's a lot of people out there, and maybe even many of our listeners, who maybe have heard this term thrown around before. Maybe you are currently going to a church where there's elders. Perhaps you even grew up at a church with elders, but you still never really heard a good answer or clarification on what exactly is this and what do they do. So that's why we're doing this podcast, and we're also doing this because in the church that I pastor, Redeemer City Church in Lafayette, we are going through the process of voting on and installing our first elder board. And so we're doing this part 1 and 2 series on what are church elders. So in part 1, you can go back and watch it on YouTube, catch up on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. In part 1, I talked about a definition for elders, explaining what it is, explaining that an elder is not referring to a generation in the church like the older people. Instead, what it's referring to is an actual office in the church, something that we read about in the New Testament. And so we went through many of those passages in the New Testament that explain what elders are, and elders are essentially shepherds to the church. We looked at the qualifications for elders according to 1 Timothy and Titus, and talked about what those meant and so on. And so now we're jumping into part 2 today on what are church elders, looking at what are the roles and the relationship to the congregation in this episode. So getting into some more specifics here in this episode, but some good stuff. And so just starting off, a little bit of a recap from part 1. First of all, in part 1, we learned once again, elders are an office of the church. These are men in the church who are responsible for shepherding the congregation. Now, what exactly does shepherding the congregation mean? We're going to be talking about that in this episode once we get to the roles of elders. And so we looked at how the New Testament refers to this group of people called elders, pastors, and overseers, and it uses these terms interchangeably. And it almost always refers to a group or a plurality of elders. Now, the only time that this is different in the New Testament is whenever you have, in one passage, Paul explains how anytime there's an accusation brought against an elder, it must be done according to 2 or 3 witnesses, and so on. So except for, something like that, it always refers to a group, a plurality. So according to what I read in the New Testament, what my church believes, and so why we're doing this, is that churches are not meant to be led by a single elder. And then third, we can read about the character qualifications for elders in 1 Timothy chapters 2 and 3, and also in Titus 1. And these lists are not exhaustive. And so what I mean by that is that whenever you read these lists, we talk about this in episode 1, whenever you read these lists, you don't necessarily read every single qualification that you would like to see in an elder. For example, it doesn't speak a lot towards leadership skills, but as we're going to see here in a moment, we do want our elders, though they're not primarily CEOs or administrators, it is a good thing for an elder to be someone who has some leadership skills, has proven themselves in somewhat of a leadership capacity. In those lists, it doesn't talk about prayer, but elders are supposed to be people who are praying for the church. And so those lists are not considered exhaustive. They're considered a starting place for what we should be looking for in elders. So here we are in part 2, and what we're going to learn about is what specifically elders do. What are the roles of elders? What do they do? And then how do they relate to the congregation? So towards the end, we'll be talking about how elders relate to the congregation, and if you're a member of a church, how you as a part of the congregation relate to the elders. So let's go ahead and move on and start talking about elder roles. So the duties of an elder can be really broad, especially if you are in a smaller church with a small group of elders, small team. They might be wearing a lot of different hats. They're not doing individualized, specialized roles. And so the duties of an elder or of an elder board can be really broad. And so what I'm going to do is just give you the 5 primary roles of elders. And so let's start off right off with number 1. First of all, elders are responsible to lead the church. I said this a moment ago. Even though elders are not primarily CEO types or administrators, or an elder is not the church world equivalent of a business leader or of a politician, whatever else you might want to think. Though that's not the case, they are responsible for leading the church. This is a part of shepherding, right? A shepherd guides the sheep to pastures where they can eat, and water to where they can drink, and away from predators and so on. And so a part of shepherding is guiding the sheep, leading the sheep. Just think of a few examples of from Scripture that imply for us the leadership responsibilities of elders. Here's one of the first ones in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5. One of Paul's qualifications for who can be an elder is that elder can manage his household well. This is one of the things he says. Now, why? Why does that matter? Well, he explains. Like I said, in 1 Timothy 3, verse 5, he says, if anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of God's church? So once again, there is an assumption by Paul that an elder is not just going to be a counselor for individual members in the church, but that he is going to be a leader, and that this leadership should at the very least be reflected in his household. Also consider how it says in both lists, in 1 Timothy and in Titus, that elders should be above reproach, and that they should be someone who sets an example for the church. Well, setting an example is a part of an implication of leadership. Consider another one. Paul also wrote this in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. He said, the elders who are good leaders are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. There you have it explicitly. Elders are leading. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, it says, obey your leaders. In the context, we know this is referring to elders. Obey your leaders and submit to them, since they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. So they can do this with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. So elders are overseers. Once again, elder, pastor, overseer, these are interchangeable terms in the New Testament. Elders are overseers who are responsible for leading the church, and they lead in a variety of ways. They lead through guiding and protecting the doctrine of the church, the vision of the church. They are involved in administration and in giving some priorities and some vision and leadership to administration and finance teams, working with the budget, presenting the budget to the congregation, and so on. They will help to guide and to filter through opportunities that the church has for missions and ministries, and so on. And so elders are responsible to lead the church. Number two, elders are responsible to shepherd the church. And so I know that I've already used this shepherding term a couple of different ways now, but consider this one. Elders are responsible to shepherd the church. What this means is that elders are shepherds over a flock that does not ultimately belong to them, but has been given to them by God to care for. You can see this whenever Paul is giving his farewell address to the elders of the church in Ephesus in Acts chapter 20. It says that they're on the shore. He's about to go onto his boat. He's giving them this farewell address, and he tells them to keep watch, number one, over themselves, so that they don't fall away into sin or bad doctrine or so on. He says, keep watch over yourselves and over the flock which God has given you to take care of, that which he purchased with his own blood. Now, who did the purchasing? Jesus did with his own blood. So if he did the purchasing, then he does the owning, right? So Christians and local congregations and members of churches are the flock of God. They are God's sheep. They belong to him, but pastors, elders, overseers are given current management on behalf of God. They take care of the sheep. And this is something that God has given to them. It is a part of the call and the charge of elders to care for the flocks that belong to God and that God has given to them to take care of. And so what this means is that being shepherds over the flock, it means that shepherds are not cowboys. Big difference there. Shepherds are not cowboys. They do not merely drive the sheep. Instead, just like a good shepherd, they care for, they protect, and they nurture the sheep. And so this speaks to the character and the type of leadership that elders should have in their church and as they shepherd the church. Once again, elders and pastors are not primarily motivators, administrators, or even program facilitators. Instead, they are shepherds. If there's really any one term that we can use to wrap up what are all the responsibilities of an elder in a church, it is that he is a shepherd. And all these other ways I'm talking about are just different ways of being a shepherd, through leading, through caring, protecting, nurturing, as we just talked about now. And also in the third point. Third, elders are responsible to teach the church. Elders are responsible to teach the church. If you were with us in part 1 of this little podcast series, then you'll remember that this was one of the only distinctions between the character qualifications for an elder and for a deacon, or really just for the kind of character that we should all have. Whenever you read 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1, and it talks about the type of character that we should want to see, that we should see in our elders, it's a type of character that really should apply to every believer. There was nothing extremely extraordinary. Like I said before, it didn't speak at all to leadership skills or many different things which we might want to see in our elders. Instead, it was something that applies to all believers. But there was this one essential distinction in both lists from all other believers. And that is that elders must be able to teach. Elders must be able to teach, Paul says, in those 2 lists and other places, because they are responsible for guarding doctrine, guarding teaching in their church, for passing down doctrine to and teaching to the people in their church, and also for correcting those who are going astray. So they need to be able to teach. And this duty of an elder to teach can be performed in a variety of ways. Because whenever we think of teaching, or we often go to preaching. So we might assume, okay, so church elders are supposed to be doing or sharing all of the Sunday preaching now in worship services. No, that's not the case. Many elders will also be able to preach, but elders do not necessarily have to be Sunday morning preachers in order to be elders and to fulfill this responsibility. Because this duty can be fulfilled in a variety of ways that an elder teaches the church. Because an elder can teach the church not just through preaching a sermon, but through teaching classes, through teaching children in the children's ministry, through doing discipleship in small groups and in one-on-one discipleship. An elder teaches through the way that he leads prayer in the congregation, through the way that he gives announcements and updates and leads worship and so on. So there are a variety of ways that an elder fulfills the role of teaching, not just Sunday morning preaching. Fourth, elders are responsible to pray for the church. Elders are responsible to pray for the church. This is one of the primary roles of being an elder, not just the leading or the teaching and preaching, but also praying. Whenever we see the very first mention or distinction of this office in the church, we see it in Acts chapter 6. In Acts chapter 6, there was this scenario going on in the church in Jerusalem where there was a division between some of the believers. Without getting too much into the weeds of it, there's a distinction, there's this controversy going on. And so in order to deal with it, the leaders of the church set up the deacons who would be servants in the church, who would take care of the needs, make sure everybody's needs were met. And they set up the deacons to do this ministry of the church and caring and serving, because they said that we need to keep our time, because the ministry was growing. They said we need to continue protecting our time for focusing on the ministry of the word and prayer. And so both deacons and elders are servants and ministers in the church, but just 2 different types of ministries. Deacons, servants of tables and of helping, providing for the members of the church. And the elders, it says, servants of the word and prayer. So praying for the church is one of the primary roles of elders. Your elders are always praying for you. They are praying for the members of the church and offering general prayers to God on behalf of the church. So, fifth, Elders are responsible to equip the church. They're responsible for equipping. Now, here's what I mean by that. I mean more than just teaching a Bible study or preaching a Sunday morning sermon, whatever else it might be. What I'm talking about is the kind of equipping that prepares you as a member of a church, participant in a congregation, that prepares you to do the ministry and to carry on the ministry yourself. So in other words, so that you are not just a passive recipient of the ministry and of the services of the church, but that you are an active participant, that you are involved, that you are a servant in the church as well, so that for maybe even some, that you become a leader of the church yourself. Consider what we see in Scripture. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 2, Paul said, "What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses," he's writing to Timothy, an elder, "commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." And so something really sad happens in church a lot. You see this all the time. What you see happening is that you have a pastor who has been faithfully leading a congregation for years, maybe even for decades. He's loved the people well. He has served them well. He's been there for them. He has taught the word well. They know their Bibles. But then the time comes whenever he retires or leaves, he moves on. And once he leaves, then things slowly start to devolve, fall apart a little bit, as there's now a vacuum of leadership. What happens, what that shows, is how, despite all the great and wonderful things that pastor was doing, he was failing in this role to be raising up faithful men who will be able to take up the mantle of leadership beyond him. In other words, what he was doing, he was failing to lead the church to be a church that would be able to thrive and survive even beyond him being there. It's a neglect of 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul tells Timothy, commit the teaching, prepare, equip faithful men who will be able to carry on the ministry of the church. An elder's teaching, in other words, should not just protect the health of the church in the present, but it should also be for the growth of the church in the future, even beyond one pastor or one board of elders. So what this means is that they must also be purposefully equipping the next generation of leaders. So this means raising up other preachers and teachers. It means raising up pastors. The elders should be raising up future elders to replace themselves. It means raising up future church planters who will go on and continue the mission to spread the gospel. So it means raising up and replacing themselves in all these offices of the church, but it also means equipping just the regular everyday members of the church to do the work of the ministry. You see this in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Whenever Paul writes and he says, there are a variety of gifts in the church. There are those who, and God has given the church people with all these variety of gifts. And you've got preachers and teachers and apostles and all these. He goes to this list and he says, and they're there for the equipping of the saints to do the work of the ministry. And so this is one of the primary roles of elders, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, whether that be in just one of the normal, everyday, regular roles that you can find yourself serving in church, or whether it be a higher office of leadership as a preacher, teacher, maybe becoming a pastor, elder, or church planter yourself one day. Consider this quote as a summary of the roles of elders from Benjamin Merkel. He said, "The office of elder is an important office because of the role the elders perform. Their primary task is not merely to run the church, but to care for the spiritual lives of the congregation. As leaders, shepherds, teachers, and equippers, elders have the immense responsibility and privilege of helping God's people become more holy and Christ-like." So, with that being a quick rundown and summary of the primary roles of elders, how do elders relate to the congregation and vice versa? First of all, this needs to be said, that it is the congregation which should be the final court of appeal in most matters of the church. What this means is that congregations are responsible, should be responsible for approving or affirming and installing the elders. So, for example, in the way that it works in my church and many other churches, is that the elders are responsible for identifying, vetting, training, and then nominating potential future elders to take their place. But ultimately, then, it is up to the congregation to affirm that calling on these new elder candidates' life, right? And so they approve them and install them. Ultimately, it is the congregation which should be responsible for adding members, welcoming new members into the church, also for removing members who are in blatant, unrepentant sin, as well as some other major decisions. And so the way that this works out in this balance between congregationalism, congregations being the final court of appeal, the largest body of authority in the church, and the elders, the way this kind of looks like and the way it works out is that the elders will lead the congregation and will have more authority than your individual church member. However, this doesn't mean that they will then rule over the members with absolute authority. And so what you have, once again, is the elders will hold more authority than just the individual church member. But the membership or the congregation as a whole will not be ruled over, as subjects by a totalitarian or authoritarian elder board. Instead, the elders will humbly and gently lead and serve the congregation, and the congregation and the individual church members likewise, in the best of scenarios, will joyfully submit to their leadership and follow them as their leaders. And so what should this relationship look like? Mark Dever, who I've referred to before, gives several really good points. First, this, as far as what this should look like, church members should trust and obey their leaders. Church members should trust and obey their leaders. What this means is that whenever you are a member of a church, that you should not acknowledge your leaders, but then not actually follow them. It means that you should not vote in affirmation of a man to be an elder, a new pastor in the church that you lead, but then subvert his leadership through gossip or through division or simply through refusing to obey and follow. Instead, it means that you should work to trust your elders, the leaders of your church, and in cases where you disagree, it's okay to disagree, but bring that disagreement directly to them, rather than holding it in secret, building up resentment, subverting their leadership, or especially through gossip, division, and so on. Remember what it says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. The author of Hebrews said to the people to follow and submit to their leaders. Make it a joy for them to lead you and not a burden. And he reminds them to do this because he says, whenever you do this, it'll work out better for both of you. Okay? So, number 2, there should be clear recognition. Clear recognition. And here's what I mean by this. There should be a clear recognition. There should be a clear recognition. The congregation should recognize their elders as gifts from God. Gifts from God for their good, and they should follow their teaching. Likewise, there should be a mutual recognition from the elders. The elders recognize the God-given authority of the congregation. As I said before, they do not lord their authority over the congregation. They do not try to act as authoritarians. Instead, they humbly serve the congregation that they are leading. So there should be a clear recognition going both ways of leadership and submission and so on. Third, this relationship between elders and their congregation, there should be a heartfelt trust. Consider 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17. Paul said, the elders who are good leaders are to be considered worthy of double honor, he says. And so if someone is worthy of double honor, then that means that by implication that they should also be worthy of trust. All right, so once again, for those elders who are working hard, who are sacrificing, who are investing to lead, to teach, and to serve you well, in return, give them that trust. Open yourself up to them relationally and give them that double honor, as Paul said in 1 Timothy 5. Also, in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 13, Paul said that the church should regard them, speaking of their leaders, their elders, he says, regard them very highly in love because of their work. The elders do not become elders because they need something else on their plate. I can tell you that the elders who are leading your church did not do it because they needed to add something to their schedule. They are doing it because they love the church and because they love you. And so, in the best case of scenarios, let us see that love going both ways, both directions. Number 4, there should be evident godliness. There should be evident godliness from the elders to the congregation. The elders should show a willingness to place their life on display, to set their life on display as an example for the church. Number 5, there should be sincere carefulness. Here's what Dever means by this, a quote from him. He said, the elders' use of authority should demonstrate their understanding that the church does not belong to them, but to Christ. Christ has purchased the church with his own blood. Therefore, the elders should cherish the church, treat it carefully and gently, and lead it faithfully and purely for the glory of God. The elders will give an account to Christ for their stewardship. So, recognizing that the church ultimately does not belong to them, that it is not their flock that they are shepherding, but that it is God's bought with Christ's blood, they should show an appropriate carefulness and respect as they steward what has been given to them by God to care for. And then lastly, number 6, how should this relationship between elders and congregation be characterized? It should be characterized by beneficial results. Whenever the elders humbly lead and serve the church, it blesses the church. It has beneficial, good results for the church. And likewise, whenever the church submits to and is joyful to follow the leaders that they have, then it results in having better leaders. And so it's like a positive feedback loop that can be created here whenever there is a healthy relationship between elders and church members that results in many, many beneficial results. So, bibliography, a couple of resources there. If you're watching this, then you can get these resources. You can see the resources on the screen. If you're not watching this, then make sure you check out the show notes for this presentation. I'll make sure that a PDF version of this presentation is in the show notes for you to download, as well as a PDF from part 1. So thank you for joining us for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that it answered some questions, provided some clarity for you on the question of what are church elders. If you enjoyed this episode, would you be sure to subscribe? Especially, would you really help us out by leaving us a rating and review of this episode so that more people can learn about Filter and can receive the message of confidence and clarity in our chaotic world. And so thank you once again. I hope that you'll join us next time. And until then, we'll see you soon.